Last Energy Symposium of the semester. There's not one next week for Thanksgiving, but there is one the following week. That is Jessica Transick, systems engineer, systems scientist from MIT. She does a lot of interesting work that's kind of multidisciplinary, looking at interacting systems and energy systems fitting into the general framework of economy and social issues. So today we will hear from Neil McAndrews, who is an independent consultant with Enterprise Risk Consulting, so he's one of the founders of that. He is going to tell us about the wheelings and dealings behind the contracts to some degree with cities going 100% renewable energy, or at least making contracts for 100% renewable electricity in Texas, and give some insight into perhaps Georgetown or some other cities that are doing this. And I'm not sure he's 100% responsible for making people in Williamson County, Georgetown, like Al Gore, or bringing Al Gore to the conference that was in town a month ago. But he says, strangely, they now like Al Gore, whereas previously they would have hated Al Gore. So renewable energy heals, well, I don't know, brings these sides together, I guess. So Neil, thank you very much for coming, and take it away.
Okay, there it goes. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about just a general subject, 100% renewable cities in Texas, and I've worked with both City of Georgetown and the City of Denton that have set these goals. And they're different in that they've sort of sped up their electric utility going to 100% renewable. I also work with a lot of other entities, other folks, and they don't choose necessarily to go 100% renewable. They may be 12%, they may be 30%, smaller numbers. And so the difference is just a matter of degree kind of thing. So I wanted to point that out, that it's not, I'm not necessarily an advocate of 100%, but there are conditions that if you have them, makes sense. Two Texas cities, Denton and Georgetown, have set goals to achieve 100% renewable energy supplies to serve their electric load in the short term. Austin Energy has also done this in the longer term, and even more extensive, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But these folks, the City of Georgetown, last year was all of its energy was from essentially wind. That doesn't mean that it's always like that. So first thing we'll define our term here is, in setting 100% renewable electric supply goals for the cities, what is 100% renewable, and why would you pick that goal? And what are some of the major decision variables that you use, and how do you go about the acquisition process, and how is uncertainty managed? Because there's risk and uncertainty in this. So what does it mean to be 100% renewables? These cities are located in the ERCOT area, and ERCOT is an energy-only market. And the electric utilities just buy energy, and that's all they have to buy. They don't have a capacity component that they have to do. And so that makes it very easy to do. So the way to do it, the way you calculate it is you just say, well, let's say a city uses 1 million megawatt hours of power a year, and so you buy 1 million megawatt hours of renewable power. And therefore, all of your energy demand is renewable. It doesn't mean the city is completely renewable in each hour. It's just on average over the year you are, and basically on average every month you are too. It does mean that the city will acquire a fixed price hedge for all of its loads, similar to conventional supply hedge. The way to look at this is, if you were a conventional load and you said, conventional city, and you said, I want to go out and fix my rates for next year, I can go out and buy power, or I can buy natural gas, which is the marginal fuel in ERCOT. And so some people will do that. They'll just buy 100% of their fuel supplies through a financial swap transaction for natural gas, and they'll say, I'm 100% hedge. Well, the only thing that these cities are doing that's kind of any difference is they're just, instead of having an NG into the swap product, there's a big RE, renewable energy versus natural gas. And that's kind of the simple way. This is more like a hedging thing, a financial transaction. But it's an important financial. It also has physical ramifications. When they buy this, often a wind field is erected, or a portion of the wind field is paid for by this financial transaction. Or a solar farm is erected, and it's paid for by that. To balance this, just like a conventional supply, you have to go to the imbalance markets, and when your sort of uniform hedges are too small, you have to buy the shortfall, and if they're too much, you have to buy, or you have to sell the over, or you sell when you have too long or too much of the resources, and you buy if you're too short. It's as simple as that. So one of the conditions that you need to be to reach this 100% renewable goal, the legal status of a non-opt-in entity, either cooperatives or municipals, they're called NOEs, and you might hear me say NOEs, and NOEs mean either co-ops or munis, basically, that own their own distribution systems, and they're not in the competitive market, and that allows them to make decisions. They're essentially the franchise holder for their loads, and they make all the decisions. They also need an open load without a long-term supply commitment, and that filters down the number of folks who can do anything like this, because lots of them have long-term legacy supply commitments, like the city of Austin, for instance. It has a nuclear plant, it has a coal plant, and has a biofuels plant and other things, and it's not open. So they have limited, the legacy supply commitments have limited what they can do in this currently. They also, like almost all folks in the market, they want to avoid natural gas and power volatility. They also have a very strong, typically, for sustained and secure rates, and even in commercial. Lots of commercial entities say, look, I just don't want my rates to change. I want to be able to budget 3 years out. I know how much energy use I'm going to have, and I just want to fix that. And if I can do that, that's great. And you say, well, what if if we focus on the spot market and prices go down, wouldn't you want that? And they go, no, I don't want that. It's kind of a strange attitude, but that's true. They really like to sustain and secure rates often. And they also have a desire, it's sort of secondary, but to lower water demands, lower pollution, lower regulatory risk in the future. And the final thing is, and this surprised me a little bit when Georgetown, they get a boost in economic development and marketing and branding from this that is not insignificant. Our city is really clean. Come, retire in our city, enjoy our golf courses. All of our electricity is renewable. That sort of thing. So the key thing another key condition that you have to have is that the cities have to have a resource plan and a portfolio standard, some kind of goal or standard. And you looked in the past and you looked at the EPA, and the EPA had stronger regulations. Renewables appeared to be the future. Their costs were coming down. So a lot of cities said, hey, we need to have a piece of this and formally set 20%, 30%. And Fred Beach over there at the city of Georgetown was instrumental in setting their renewable portfolio standard. And so that was a long-term, planning goal that was very useful to help, implement this. In the city of Denton, they had a renewable portfolio standard that they set, I think, 2 years ago, and it was for 70% renewables by 2019, and going to 100% renewable by 2035. But often, a lot of the NOEs have no discernible resource plans or have shorter-term plans based upon ad hoc market supply options. And there are a lot of small cities that, they don't put much effort into planning, whether it's renewable or conventional power. Other NOEs sort of follow the leader. They copy what they see is going on in the market, and they buy renewables, and sometimes they don't recognize the underlying risk because they haven't done the planning, and they don't achieve what they think they will. So here's an example of a renewable portfolio standard for the city of Austin, and this is what it typically looks like. In 2020, they will meet 50% of all of energy needs through the use of renewable resources. In 2025, that ratchets up to 65% of all energy needs through the use of renewable resources. And 2030, reduce carbon dioxide emissions from all city-controlled generation resources to 0. So at that point, I think all their legacy facilities that actually produce carbon dioxide, they're going to have to somehow reduce their generation. But one of the ways they can do it is by over-purchasing renewables, and then use balancing. And so they'll still be net 0 carbon. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to do that. But by 2050, they achieve the goal of reaching net 0 community-wide greenhouse gases. And that's an interesting one. I don't know what all is behind that. If it goes into the transportation sector, and like a lot of people have talked to, but those are stretch goals. What we're talking about here for these 100% are really more like a hedging program, standard hedging program that people have used since the early 90s. So one of the backgrounds is the state of Texas renewable portfolio standard. In the deregulation bill that they made in 2000, the year 2000, they said basically we want to make sure that we want to incent the market to use a renewable power, and so it was a requirement for the folks who were in the deregs, for those representatives, that they show that they have purchased a certain amount of renewable power. And that was the standard. It was, I think it was like 5,000 megawatts. That law, they reached all the goals, even though the goals were set out in, I think, in 2028. Every goal that they set, they achieved by 2010. They were way ahead of it. They went past it like a comet, basically. And so Senator Troy Fraser, who was the original author of the Renewable Portfolio Standard in the dereg bill, he decided we don't need this anymore because we've achieved it. We're going to call it a victory, and we're going to take this out. And the Senate actually voted on it, but the House didn't pick up on it because there are details where they had some issues in it. But the point that I was trying to make here, on the Texas level, there's no longer any kind of renewable portfolio push. So the main impetus for this decision is that renewable prices have declined. And how low will they go? They've declined. And other technological things are coming in, and people have this viewpoint of the future where, that renewables are the future. They're the future. And they know that intermittency might be a problem, but they don't want to be left behind technologically. They don't want to be, using sort of, XT PCs or whatever they are, old, like my phone here, very outdated. So they don't want to do that. They want to be more modern. And so here's an example. This is from NARAL, and it shows how the 4 classes of PVs, installed photovoltaic modules, have gone down. Both this is the residential section. Is this residential section, the commercial sector, and then for both a fixed tilt utility scale PV and a utility scale PV that has a one-axis tracker. And you can see they start at 2010 and go to 2017. And you can see that the prices have declined very rapidly. Not as much as for residential, but certainly for commercial. And if you look at the utility scale PV one-axis tracker, it's declined by 80% since 2010. That's a huge reduction. And you can see it's not just in the sort of the modules, although those have gone down, but importantly, some of the soft costs, the construction costs, and installed labor costs and that sort of thing. Other aspects of it have declined even more so. So they're getting better at installing these things. And that's true almost in every sector, but the residential still is lagging, I think, in that. But the prices are, 1.1 cent per watt DC. So this, very few times you see a commodity in 7 years drop 80%. That's rare. But here's another one. These are wind prices, and this is from Lazard and Berkeley Lab. And you can see in 2010, the prices for wind, well, it's $60 to $100 a megawatt hour. And today, it's on the right-hand side, it's, coalesces around 20 or so, even less. And so that has been also a drop about 75%. So these are the things that make people very interested. So here's a graph that I made, basically. So it's an illustrative graph. That means it's not, well, it's based on some pretty good things, but not necessarily a complete answer to everything. But you can see here that if you go look at the forward curves for power, and you look at forward curves for natural gas, and you look at the heat rates, and you develop these, power price curves. We have a high, low, and average power price curve. And then we have a fixed price renewable, and it's at $25. A lot of the, that may be high, but so that's in the gray bar there, and this is over 20 years. And you notice that the renewable price does not escalate. It does not escalate. It does not inflate. It's fixed. It's fixed in nominal terms, but that's going to be its price forever. So in some ways, think about that. That's very unusual. Usually you have O&M or some kind of adder, and you have, things like you have to rewind the turbines, you have to overhaul the turbines and do maintenance and stuff like that. But none of that's included. This is a fixed price. It doesn't change. That's what it is. $25, it stays $25 in nominal terms the entire time. But look at everything else escalates or it has some kind of inflation aspect to it. So this is an interesting aspect of this. And so if you think about setting rates for anybody, and you say, I'm going to set a rate here, and I know that if there's any inflation out there, the rate is going to be lower and lower in real terms. If I was a consumer, I'd go, that sounds pretty good to me. If my rate is guaranteed to be lower and lower in real terms in the future, it's inflation proof, it's kind of nice. And so this is one of the reasons, just looking at this chart, you say, gee, this is the cheapest thing I can buy. And I think that's my customers would like this. And if you look at these rates, historically, you go back and say, when was the last time I could put in a rate like this? Well, not 20 years ago, not 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago or something like that. But I don't even think that then. I think these are the lowest rates in nominal terms, and then in really the lowest rates in real terms that you've seen. So that's a compelling story right there. The other thing that's going on is, there's a technological advancement. If you look at all the modules, they get more and more efficient, the PV modules. And this is a good example of the vintage year that you install a wind farm. In 2009, your capacity factor is maybe 35%, and in 2017, the capacity factor is 45% or higher, over 50%, and this is increasing, right? So these things are getting more efficient. For every dollar you put in, you get more out of it. The difference between 35% capacity factor and 45% capacity factor is like a third, So that means the installed cost is, you're getting more of a return for the same installed cost by about 35%. That's one of the reasons why prices are so low. So the thing about all this stuff is that there's uncertainty and risk management that needs to be done. You size this so that you're trying to optimize the amount that you buy in every hour, basically. And so you try to diversify and make sure that it matches your load. And so if you have 1 million megawatt hours in it, typically in the middle of the summer, you have a lot more load. You make sure that's covered somehow by your supply. So you're really trying to match, and back to back, if you have demand, you're trying to match load in all hours. And so that is something in the resource selection you have to do, and then as you manage it and create imbalances, you have to manage that. If you're short, you have to buy in the market. If you're long, you have to sell. Congestion management, though, is probably one of the most difficult things in this market. Because there's been an explosion of renewables, the transmission lines are, overburdened. And the way they fix that is if you don't have enough transmission, they just simply curtail it, or they ask you to voluntarily curtail by saying, when you sell, we'll give you a negative price for this. So they penalize you for running. And that's an effective way of managing your transmission system. Some people say, well, that's not efficient. Well, it's not perfectly efficient, but it's similar to how when you bid in a conventional resource into the market, and whether you're picked up or not with your pricing curves. If your prices are higher than the market will bear, you don't run. And so you don't incur any variable cost to serve that, but you don't run. So you don't get any revenue or net revenue. Well, in a wind thing, if you're turned off, what marginal cost, what fuel have you bought for it? Well, you haven't, it's zero. Very similar kind of thing. And so the market is very rational in these rules of how it disposes of this stuff. And congestion changes over time, and therefore the selections of resources and strong planning as to location is needed. And so you'll see, because I'll go on here, that this will probably be better. Every renewable resource is different. Each has its own technology. Each has its own location uniqueness. And prices must be risk adjusted as to when those things will actually produce and what the pricing point is in location. So one of the big things on wind is this is the wake effect of wind turbines. So you buy a wind farm, let's say, and you have this wind farm, and the thing that you don't really know, they know what, in a sort of a wind tunnel, what the turbines will do, but they don't know what they'll do in sort of real life in a sort of a geographic configuration. And this picture is a great picture. I love it because what it shows is it's like a natural wind tunnel with dyed air or something like that. And it shows that this is over the ocean, right? And the atmospheric conditions are just right so that as the turbine turns, it creates liquid. It takes a vaporous gas and turns it into liquid. So It's just really cool, like a wind turbine for this whole thing. And the big thing about these wake effects is this. The first turbine creates turbulence. And when the wind comes to the first turbine, it's in laminar flow, right? And then it churns it up, creates a wake. That's a turbulent flow. And that hits the second turbine, and so it reduces its output. The second turbine creates more turbulence. It hits the third and the fourth and so on. And so you can see at the end, in the horizon out there, all you see is turbulence out of this thing. And so the power has been totally taken out of the wind, and the last turbines may not be producing hardly anything. So this wake effect is critical about how you set this grid up, what the configuration is, relative to the prevailing winds and relative to other wind farms. And so you can be buying a wind farm, and it's behind another wind farm, and it has this turbulence, and your wind farm doesn't produce anywhere near where you thought. But I just think this is a great picture because it, it's the size of it, it illustrates this sort of compounding turbulent wake effect so well. This is another great picture from ERCOT, and it shows two nearby solar installations. And the first day here, this was in 1997, you can see that that was a sunny day. The two farms produced at their maximum. The next day was a cloudy day, or only partly sunny. And the next day was a partly cloudy day, etc. And you can see how, even though they're very close together, clouds essentially change the output of this and creates different capacity factors from these. And so you have to forecast this going forward. So, you go and look at visibility, look at fronts, look at all these things, and you discount the forecast based on this. The other thing is, when you're doing resource planning, it's nice to separate, have two of them that are far removed from each other. So you have different effects, and you don't get them all, putting all your eggs in one basket, basically. This is Texas. It shows it's the whole United States, but it shows in Texas here, you have radiation levels. And you can see that if you go out to, say, as you go into West Texas, east of Abilene, somewhere, the radiation goes up. And as you go past, let's say, Odessa, it really goes up. And then as you go to El Paso, it's really high. And that is a big effect. The other thing that it's an effect, if all things were equal, you'd want to put your solar installation as far west as you possibly could. And the reason why is because you get a time effect. Solar peaks at local noon, whatever that is, and the peak of the loads are like at 5 o'clock. And so you want to, the farther west you go, you get that time translation thing. And that's an important aspect. So that's why people would like to go as far west. The problem is there's no transmission out there. The second thing is rainfall. And so if you create kind of a Venn diagram between these two, you could find an area where you have the best solar radiation and the least chance of rain or clouds, although it's pretty dry out there. The same thing is true here is the wind map for this. And one of the things, if you go back way back at the end, one of the reasons why we have all this stuff is George W. Bush said, looking at a wind map like this, and he goes, Texas can be the Saudi Arabia of wind. I've always remembered that resource. And actually, if Texas is the Saudi Arabia, then Oklahoma is like the Kuwait, and Nebraska is Nigeria, and Iowa and South Dakota are Russia. But they all produce huge amounts of wind right in the center of the country, and it's also very predictable as an energy source. And so I think doing that and doing the CREZ was for diversification. It wasn't necessarily for the environmental aspects. It was for diversification. And I think George Bush was, being in the energy business, he goes, look, what if we can do generation not have any fuel associated with it? And so I think that was a pretty smart thing. So planning and evaluation. One of the things you have to do is make sure that all the projects, you put out an RFP, you get all these projects, the most recent projects, and they're all influenced by tax subsidies that they've had over the time frames. And so you evaluate each one of them. You look at the topography and the site and the surroundings. You look at the place and location in relation to high voltage lines, the 345 backbone in Texas where all the resources are essentially gathered together. And you explore all the congestion and CRR costs and future risks associated with them. How will generation development unfold? Here's a good example. This is just a couple of days ago. And you can see, even though we built transmission line up in the Panhandle is bright blue. And if you looked at on the sidebar here, you can see these prices. And those prices were like negative $25. And what they were saying is, we have too much power. I think it was about 3,500 megawatts. And we want you to turn off a bunch of it. So we're going to penalize you for being on. And other areas, as soon as you get out of that transmission constraint, it's almost like traffic at rush hour. As soon as you get away from that, it opens it up, and the prices go up to $20. And so this is something, ERCOT can kind of easily manage some of this stuff just by penalizing everybody who overproduces. So one of the things is it's kind of an iterative process to evaluate the portfolio effects. You measure how the wind or solar resource fits into the net load. You adjust the levels to take in the PPA to better match the portfolio. You compare the correlation with other resources. And what you can do is you can kind of put a variance minimization and select portfolio levels like the Markowitz kind of minimum variation portfolio selection. And that helps you to come with that. On a practical sense, in a day-ahead market, you dispose of excess supply and purchase supply shortages. And so you have to have very good forecasts because you're forecasting every one of these variables. The blue line is the load. The area graph is wind. It's in pink. And then the other thing that you have are market prices. It's not shown here, but the prices are forecast. And this is Stephen. He does a lot of that stuff for me. And so what you're doing is you buy these market purchases and you sell these things, but it's really dependent on how well you can forecast how much of the resource that you have. And in this case, the resource was a little short at night from hours 1 through 5, and you bought, and then it basically went to zero from hours 6 through hour 13, and then it picked up again during the peak, and to the extent that you started selling. And this is not this is not an atypical day. The things that affect wind forecasts are, temperature, the direction of the wind, and how the direction moves, the time of day, the surrounding installations of wind, the topography, gusts, and atmospheric mixing. And so, for instance, in some farms, if the wind is out of, let's say, the southwest, you only get about half the production because there's a valley in the southwest, and that valley starts creating convection, and your wind is derated. That's okay if your predominant wind is from the southeast, but not if it's from the southwest. The things that affect solar forecasts is very similar. It's the temperature, the time of year, daylight savings time shift, sky cover, soiling, that's dust, rain and dust, and clouds, and atmospheric mixing. So one of the things about the risk in all this, and when you're trying to match, the load and do this opposition financial hedging kind of thing, is the overall extent of the wind. And that can vary. And you can see that this varies quite a bit over a yearly basis. This is from ERCOT, and it shows like the last, I think, 7 years or so, the wind has been above average, or much above average or average. But this will change, and sometime it will go below average. And when it goes below average, the wind will probably drop 15 or 20% year-over-year basis. And so this will come, and this is one of the things you need to add into your awareness of things that will happen at some point of time. And it depends on what kind of large-scale atmospheric conditions you're in, what kind of year you're in, El Nino, La Nina, that sort of thing, big macroscopic things. If you look forward, and this is ERCOT's long-term assessment, and it's an interesting thing. This is the case. They had a bunch of different cases, right? Because they're really good planners, I think. And this particular case, they're looking at all these prices and that sort of thing. And basically, in 2017 to 2031, this was without the Clean Power Plan, and so with relatively hefty. If you could go down here, you can look at the gas price. It's in 2017, 374. Well, I don't think we've ever reached 3. That's optimistic. And then 469, 545, and 628. Those are pretty high gas prices. And as a result of this whole thing, the only thing they added was solar. And they added 20,000 megawatts by the 2030 of solar. And I think this is a scenario and that sort of thing. That might be a little high, but I think their general level, let's say in 2022, is let's say 8,000 megawatts of solar. That could happen. Now, of course, there are tariffs being discussed and quotas and import quotas and all this other stuff. And that'll be rationalized out at some point, but I do think the cost is just, in comparative, it just has a comparative advantage. So I think you'll see something like this, and I think that's coming. And at the same time, even the retirements from, of coal that they show here, it says they're going to retire 6,278 megawatts in 2022. And they're well on the way to that, I have to say. So, but then nothing else. And so you still have coal when you're at 2031, and I think it constitutes something like, somewhere in here, was it 16% of the market? And yeah, coal generation, 16.1. And so, and I think that kind of matches my view, is that you're not going to get rid of all these sort of legacy units. You're going to get rid of the ones that need a lot of repair and a lot of O&M. So, I don't know what time it is, but am I doing okay? So the compelling concurrent economic advantages to renewables. The renewables satisfy a risk-averse utility by removing fuel management process, which has been traditionally difficult to manage for NOEs. The renewables provide long-term supply without debt service or maintenance from the buyer. The renewables avoid future CO2 and other potential regulations. And the renewables provide a positive picture of the utility in the region. But renewables come with significant location and management risks. And that's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for that question. You can see why keeping it weird in Austin is actually harder than keeping it normal in Georgetown. Keep it normal, and they went to 100% renewable, and Austin's trying to keep it weird, and we can't do it. So, because we're stuck with these legacy assets. So, anybody have a question for Neil on how this stuff works? Obvious.
Just a quick question for you. When you're working with munis and co-ops, do you see any hesitation on their part where they're looking at, well, if I lock in this $25 megawatt hour contract now, is that going to be next year? Is that going to be 20? Is it going to be 19? The same as they can see people that locked in contracts 2 or 3 years ago that were more expensive.
Yeah, I tell them that all the time, and they go, yes, it's possible, but often these folks have a long experience in energy, often there, and they say, yeah, I remember when it was 25 cents a megawatt hour for natural gas, and then it was 10, and then it was 3, and they believe, the price of renewables will go down, but the marginal price is always going to be natural gas. And so they feel they have a comparative advantage, and they recognize that. And they'll say, natural gas, the prices that you saw there, let's say $45 a megawatt hour, they're buying at 25. They don't care if the price goes down 50%. If they grow, they'll just buy more at the market. And that was one of the other things I didn't mention about somebody like Georgetown. They're growing at 7% per year, very fast growth. So they buy 100% today. In 7 years, that's 50%. In 14 years, that's 25%. And so they have to, continuously keep up with the market just because of the growth.
The thing I worry about is actually the reverse corollary to that question. 20 years from now, if you want to continue what they've achieved today, not just because of the growth, but demand. There's only at some point so much wind and solar that the ERCOT is going to handle. Nobody knows what that number is, but it's theoretically out there somewhere. Is just the simple demand for renewables going to increase the price of them versus the actual operating cost and capital cost, to where there are more people scrambling for a 20-year solar PPA 20 years from now, and there's a diminished supply of what's available.
Yes, I agree with that also. One of the ways they're meeting that is all these folks are going and saying, we're going to also try to do demand side on our thing. At Georgetown, they had a West Side Service Center, and the city put solar on it, and it turns out to be very. It wasn't actually their jurisdiction. It was kind of in a neighbor's jurisdiction, and their prices are, I won't name who they are, a little higher. So they get to sell it. Yeah, it's west of Georgetown, west side. Okay. So they're doing really well on that. They're very happy with it. And those things are competitive sort of in situ. And that's what they are going to be emphasizing too at the same time. And so hopefully that will be able to manage some of that.
So one of your graphs, you were talking about how you would buy and sell power depending on whether the wind and solar that you might have contracted for was less than or more than your load. And you're saying that you're a consultant. So does it mean that you, as a consultant, provide this service for your clients? Like this is a business idea this is a business plan.
Right. Well, part of it is, I'm trying to train, in some cases, we trained people to do this, and that's one of the things we do. And you start off saying, this is how it's done, and this is how it's managed, and stuff like that. And some of, my customers are saying, we don't really want to, you just do it. Right. Other people have trained it, and that's what I prefer, but we're doing it also. And part of it is to make sure this is something similar to what I've done in the past. For instance, I've done managing natural gas storage into a natural gas system, and so it's a similar kind of forecasting, pricing, and so I've done a lot of that. I helped build a large case compressed air energy storage, and manage how that storage and pricing would do up in Ohio. And so it's a very similar kind of concept.
Good. Keep in mind, so he has a geology degree and a degree here from UT in what's called Energy Resource Management, but now it's the Energy and Earth Resources Program, so he's a graduate of that multidisciplinary program of UT.
And it's an excellent program, and it was interdisciplinary, and some of the same things that I learned back in the 80s, I'm using today. A lot of them, actually.
Any other questions?
Now there's a question.
One quick one. Would you be willing to share your slides that you showed to us today?
Pardon?
Would you be willing to share your slides
Oh,
from
yeah,
today?
sure.
Okay. Second one, where do you see battery storage coming into play in all of this?
Battery storage, if you go, you can go out and get a bid for battery storage right now. Combination of battery storage and wind, and I see that coming in, starting now, and over the next 4 or 5 years, being increasingly used. And I also see that people are going to repurpose the wind that would end in wind installations in 2002. They're going to just rebuild them, replace them on the same mass and stuff like that, repower them. So they're replacing those vintage machines with modern machines.
Do you see like a trigger point where storage really becomes so much more competitive? Right now, I think the numbers were $250 per kilowatt hour for Tesla's Australian installation that had 100 megawatts, 129 megawatt hours. That's pretty aggressive pricing right there.
Right.
But and with every decrease in price per unit there, obviously it opens new markets, but do you see where the floodgates would open, any threshold price?
Well, that's a good question. I really think I'm more of a electrical vehicle person. That the electrical vehicle, once people start realizing the inherent value of them, that will create demand, and there's just going to be unbelievable competition for battery storage, and I think that will be tied into the houses. And that's where I think demand side, what I call it is, I call it the killer app. You have all the pieces for a lot of this stuff already there. All you need is a programmable thermometer, smartphone, and some kind of program that does it for you, and then some way to check that. And so that would be something that would be, I believe over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see that, and then people start aggressively marketing that. And when they tie in the battery to that, that's when it's going to, so I think it's going to be the use over a bigger thing. The bigger problem is I will sell you power, and whatever competitor you have, I'll reduce your price by 15 to 20%. And I think that's going to induce huge demand. And if you have electric cars, the same thing. All that will be integrated together. And people will be getting these incredible deals. And that's when the floodgates come out.
And then, Georgetown's one certain size. I don't know if it's 1% of the ERCOT load or whatever. Where do you see where that works for small munis or NOEs, but when it grows too large, the concept where ERCOT may not be able to take care of the balancing, because this depends upon ERCOT being able to real-time balance, right? It averages over the whole year. ERCOT has to manage every 5 minutes, the skid, and every 4 seconds.
Yeah, I think my deal is I think it's saturated myself. I think, I look at some of these things, and I think they're going to be buying the PPAs and stuff like that, but I think that's going to be basically saturated. And they're going to see things like this, ERCOT saying, yeah, I'll fix the transmission problem by just penalizing everybody who buys this, I think that is going to, people are going to start concentrating on the risk, and that's going to slow development significantly on the wind side. Now, solar doesn't have the same kind of thing, and I think that's going to be something that occurs. But as to, a lot of cities are just, they're indifferent. They're not even, they're indifferent to it. And they buy by word of mouth. What they copy someone else. And a lot of them don't like to copy Austin, of course, because Austin's, this too strange. But of course, they are copying Austin. They sort of damn by faint praise or something like that.
Well, they can claim copy Austin or Georgetown now, so I guess they got their bases covered. Any other questions? No? All right, there's no more questions, then thank you very much, Neil. If anybody wants to speak to him afterwards, come on up.
Excellent.